Thank you. Okay, I want to start, and some of you would let me share this, and really appreciate so much. Really appreciate so much the opportunity and the time to share together with us some of my reflections from my illness, some of and really a lot of gratitude. Just want to move my screen back. Sorry, just give me a moment. Okay, I think that's fine. I want to start by appreciating very much, and I'll mention that later, the prayers, the support that many of you have given us during the time of my illness, and I'll mention that in a moment. So what I hope to do, still see my window is still halfway there. Okay, what I hope to do this time with us is just three things. One is I'm going to give what I call my testimony from the ICU bed, because while I was sitting at the ICU bed, especially in the last few weeks of my stay, I ended up writing about 90 pages of my reflections. So I hope you have enough time and enough grace for 90 pages of my reflection. And then I'm going to then pull back a little bit and talk about a background that led to my illness that I think is very, very helpful. And then I'll conclude by drawing some lessons that I think will be more of lessons that give us an element of hope as we look into the future. And before I get into my testimony, I want to read a line a poem that many of you would know and associate with me, which is Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going directly to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on it being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. You know, when I read Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, you agree that he could actually have been writing about our times. For in the time we are in, we have, in one moment in a day, you can have the best of times, and you receive a phone call that makes it the worst of times. You can be in that time where you know what to do in terms of wisdom, and in another moment, you're completely dumbfounded in the age of foolishness. You can find yourself in an epoch of belief where it's very clear what you believe in, and in another moment, you are in the darkness of incredulity. And in one moment, you can find yourself in light and a lot of light and illumination, and in the next moment, in deep despair of darkness. And as he says, it can also be a spring of hope. And in a moment like that, it also becomes a winter of despair. So let me start by telling you my experience from the ICU bed. May of this year, towards the end, beginning of June, the first day of June, and around that time, I found myself, I visited one of my brothers-in-law who had a cough, and at that point had not been diagnosed to have COVID. I didn't even get into the house. I didn't even greet him. I had my mask, he had his mask, but he seems to have, I seem to remember like he entered the car that I had been driving. I was outside the car. He must have touched the steering wheel or something else, and I didn't realize that I needed to sanitize it. That's the only thing I can think of. When I came from the trip to his place, I started feeling unwell. Subsequently, he was tested to be positive for COVID. And then I went to test, and to my horror, I found that I was positive for COVID. And the doctor said to me, Sammy, don't worry, you are young, you don't have to worry about this. And in any case, you don't have any comorbidities. And I had been starting to jog, and somebody said to me in my 50s that it is important to be jogging. So I started to jog, and I had a target to jog 10 kilometers, and now I had just reached the 10 kilometers. I was feeling very nice about myself. So in terms of health, I was doing fairly well. So the doctor said, don't worry, there is nothing serious to worry about. We will manage this. And we started managing it. I needed to mention that on the day that I tested positive, my brother-in-law, that same brother-in-law, passed away that morning. And it was a difficult time for us. It was a very difficult time. So he passes away that morning. And in the evening, I get the phone call from the doctor saying I have tested positive. So for my wife, it was a really double whammy. And then the question of, is she positive, the children, but she had tested negative, and so on. So the doctor said, don't worry, we will manage this. And so we started managing it at home. I was in isolation. I was getting full treatment, everything that you can think of, from the vitamins and everything else, right to ivermectin that everybody fights about. And so everything was there. I had a physiotherapist who was attending to me, and it seems like it was going very well. And then in one day like that, boom, I don't know what happened. I went to see the doctor. When I got back home, I could not walk out from the car. And from there, it turned south quite quickly. By the evening of that day, my lungs collapsed. I was rushed to ICU in Millpark Hospital, which is one of the hospitals in Johannesburg. And by the time we got there, the doctor started preparing my wife for the worst. They actually said, this is too far too gone. We're not sure what is going to happen here. And by morning, they phoned my wife to come and pick up my clothes and my belongings because they didn't think I will need them again. And from then on, they started talking to my wife, telling her the worst of where things were. They decided to, they started by giving me oxygen, and that wasn't working. They then intubated me, which was cutting the trachea, putting in the pipes, and that didn't seem to work. And eventually they put me on an ECMO machine and on 100% life support, and I was in a coma for 2 weeks. And just in case, Simon, you want to ask me whether I did see St. Peter, I do charge for the stories about what happened there. So if you want to know more about that, I'll give you my bank account details, and then I can tell you exactly what I saw. So I was 2 weeks in a coma. And you know, again, George, I know that I am God's beloved. How do I know? The Bible tells me he gives his beloved sleep. I don't know any of you that have slept for 2 weeks. I slept for 2 weeks in a coma. I know I am God's beloved because in that time I was flat out. I knew nothing. So when you guys were praying and crying for me, I was lights out. I had good, beautiful sleep. When I woke up, I found pipes coming from my mouth, pipes coming from my trachea, pipes on the sides, pipe from my nose, pipe from my groin, all over. There were pipes. And then stayed on in ICU for 7 weeks. Now, I'm going to cut that story short because the beautiful part of it is just how God used my wife to talk to a few friends. Those friends, then she started finding a lot of phone calls. She decided to create a WhatsApp group. The WhatsApp group grew to, I think, over 200 people, and many of you were part of that WhatsApp group. And that WhatsApp group gave rise to many other prayer groups. And I'm really, really grateful for people who were praying for me during that entire time. Because as I said, I was actually saying to somebody today, I remember once in that entire time when I prayed for myself. I remember once when I prayed for myself. And it was a time when, for some reason or the other, I couldn't breathe. It was towards the end, I couldn't breathe. I started gasping for air. And I called the nurses. They couldn't see what was wrong, but I couldn't breathe, and I knew I was suffocating. And in that moment, I remember just panicking and really crying to God, saying, God, you have brought me to this point. There must have been a reason for you to do that. Now, an incredibly difficult experience for my wife, as you can imagine. She never went to the funeral of her brother, her younger brother, whom she loved very much. And the entire time, together with many of you, crying and praying for my healing. And I'm really grateful to God for that. So I will not go into give the other stories around that. I think we can, the truth is that I don't know anything about St. Peter. I don't know anything about the beautiful pearly gates, because I was lights out. And when I woke up, it was to find that there were many people who have been praying for me as well. I want to take you back a little bit, and I want to give you a bit of context about how I got into a little bit about my life. I have a hate-love relationship with the church. Yeah, I know I shouldn't say that, but I have a hate-love relationship with the church. I have found myself incredibly over time, not just now in my time in Kenya, but even in my time here, incredibly on the wrong side of the church law, and finding myself at times really disillusioned. I find myself loving the church very much as God's agency for transformation of the world. At the same time, there are many, many times when I just find myself completely in despair. Living in South Africa specifically has made me to question a lot about the institutional church. I think for me, living here, in many cases, and I'm generalizing, I have found that racism, for example, if there's a place that racism still remains, it is very much in the church. And I cannot understand that. But I also ask myself, in the time that we are in, when there's so much pain around, where is the church? Where is the church? Where is the church in this? When people are asking for hope and direction, and a lot of the very solid voices here have been the people who are calling for the churches to reopen. And I sit back and I say, is that the most important agenda, for the churches to reopen? So I found myself, even prior to my illness, disillusioned with church. It got to the point we were thrown out of the Anglican Church. A whole congregation was thrown out, not just me. And the bishop said we were thrown out because we were asking questions. I didn't know there is a sin called asking questions, but I discovered then that you don't ask questions. You're told to pray, you pray. You're told to face east, you face east. So I found myself disillusioned around that. And then I started asking myself, where is hope? Where is hope? A quest for hope. And with a group of people that we were part of that church, all thrown out, asking ourselves, now what? Now what? And the group said to me, Sammy, we've been together for 10 years. We are going to continue as Church Unusual. So we formed Church Unusual and we continued with it. And I told them from the beginning that I don't believe my calling is to be a pastor. So I will lead on until we are able to establish a way of getting a pastor who can continue with the congregation. And during that time of facing these congregants who are asking questions, what did we do wrong? Where is God? I then ended up writing a book, Beacons of Hope. And in the book, Beacons of Hope, what I found was God speaking to me through stories of people, stories of scriptures, my own experience as I wrestled with where is hope. And the main thing, as you can see in the subtitle of that book, was finding that hope was not necessarily an arrival point. It was a quest. It was a longing. It was a journey too, rather than a point in time that now we can say, I have arrived and this is hope. But I also found myself incredibly lonely in that quest. I found myself incredibly lonely because a lot of people around me seemed like they already had the answers. If Jesus is the answer, so we don't have a problem. We don't need a question. And even the people we started that journey with, after a while, they started saying to me, but Sammy, are you a real pastor? Were you ordained? And I thought, goodness, I thought that's what we were thrown out from. And now you're asking me the same question about, am I ordained? And so I started finding myself feeling lonely. And at some point, even here at home, I remember talking to my wife and saying, do I really have any friends? Do I have friends? Where are they? And very much like Elijah saying, God, I'm the only one left with this. And that was my experience. I'm sharing with you my own experience, because everybody else seemed so settled in what they were talking about. So through this journey, what have I learned? And I will finish with that. I think for me, and I hope that by drawing from this, my experience, we can try to find hope in difficult times, because we are all living in very difficult times. And I think, where do we find hope? And the first thing I've learned through this painful experience of being ill is the whole aspect of communion. The whole aspect of communion. Communion. And the first thing that I mentioned there is to understand God as our friend. John chapter 15 and verse 15. Jesus says to his disciples, and by the way, he's talking very hard things to them. He's talking to them even later about how he's going to be crucified. And in John 15, he says, verse 15, I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. And this idea of God as a friend is very foreign, for example, to Islam. This idea of God as a friend. I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. I have called you friends. And why does he call them friends? Because a servant does not know his master's business. I have called you friends because everything I learned from the Father, I have told you. Now, something very interesting with my illness, as we reflected on it later, we actually realized that God had been preparing us. God had been telling us without us actually realizing what he had been doing. The weeks before my illness, we had been talking as a family, reading through Christian suffering. We followed Paul through his sufferings. We read through James about Peter about suffering. We went to Joseph in Genesis 37 onwards, and we were talking about Christian suffering and how to behave within a time of suffering. A few weeks before I got sick, one time I happened to ask my children, supposing something happened to me, who are my friends that you would turn to and you would expect them to be there for you here in South Africa? Who are they? And they gave me 3 names. And in their presence, I phoned the 3 names. And I said, my children have said, if something should happen to me, you know that you're responsible for them. I had absolutely no clue what was coming. I had absolutely no clue. But now, as I listen to Christ talking to his disciples, and as I listen to our conversations, and my wife read through the beacons of hope, she started to discover, man, it's like my husband knew this thing was coming. How did he know this thing was coming? Well, God as a friend, and he then reveals the things, the secret things to his friends. But the other thing I have learned over this time around communion is this idea of faith as a quest. I think we've missed it by talking of faith as an arrival. Faith is more important as a quest. The Bible tells me about the people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. And it says in verse 13, they did not receive that which was promised them. They did not receive. They journeyed with a longing. They journeyed with a question. And so for me, I think, when we start thinking about our relationship with Christ, it should be a relationship of question, a relationship of saying, I want to know, a longing. Not that I know, not Jesus is the answer, full stop. I think Jesus is more helpful as a question, as a quest, as a longing. They walked with a longing. And so even as we journey with Christ now in the context of the challenges we are facing, we should not try to water down our questions. We should not try to water down those things that puzzle us around why am I sick? Why are we the ones who are targeted by this? Why COVID? I think those are questions that we should be asking. Our faith as a quest, as a longing, as a longing. I wish I had more time because we would get a little bit more into this, but I don't want to derail. But do you remember, every time Jesus was faced with people who wanted an answer, shall we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Jesus says, give me a coin. Whose inscription is on that coin? They say Caesar. He says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. Now, do you call that an answer? Because every time I have a coin, I'll have to ask, does this belong to God or to Caesar? Then someone comes to Jesus and says, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, you must love your neighbor as you love yourself. And the guy says, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells him the story of what we call the Good Samaritan. And at the end, Jesus says, so who was his neighbor? And the end story ends there. Is that an answer? No, because Jesus knows that what we need in faith is not an answer. It's a question. It's a longing. So I have questions coming from my health, from my ill health. I have questions. I'm journeying with them coming from the bereavement. But I love it that God welcomes those questions. And that's where I find deep communion with God, with this friendship. And then the second thing that I have learned through this is the power of community. All friends rallied around us. And John chapter 13, and verse 35. And this is where Jesus has started by washing his disciples' feet and so on. And in John chapter 15 and verse 35, he says to his disciples, by this everyone will know you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Love one another. You know, this is the magnet that should attract the non-believers, that they look at us and they say, wow. Now, I told you about the WhatsApp group that my wife created and people joined in. I had people in that group who are Hindus. There were colleagues who are Hindus who joined in. This Hindu lady now says to me, Sammy, I have never seen so much faith, so much love. I started praying the prayers that these people made. You know, she saw love. And I look at the churches today and I think, oh goodness, would somebody talk about seeing so much love as an unbeliever that they feel like, I want to join them. I want to join them. They have love for one another. And there's something else there. The love was evidenced by giving. The same thing we read in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave. The people who were on that WhatsApp group, together they joined together and they said, let's not just pray for Sammy, let's also give. Let's also give. And do you know, they have covered our hospital bills to an extent we would never have imagined. What would I say? Love that was demonstrated by giving. Community, this sense of community. I think it's something we have forgotten in the church. And the third one is companion. And some of you who have walked a lot with me know about this, that I love this word companion, because the word companion comes from the word panis, which is bread. It's about breaking bread together. And Jesus says in John 6:33, I am the bread that comes from heaven. And he talks about this bread being given to the world. We need to break bread with a broken world. But how do we do that when we ourselves are broken? And I want to submit to us, it's this idea Henry Nouwen talks about of a wounded healer, of realizing that we have a calling to break bread with the world. And what does that also mean? It is to lament the pain of the world. There's so much pain around us. And we need Jeremiahs who are going to write lamentations, crying for the cries of the people, not trying to answer. Let me finish with this. And some of you may have heard it. Chris, the mother says, Chris, don't come home late anymore. Small boy, don't come home late from the street. And Chris says, yeah, mommy, I won't come home late. And one day Chris comes home late and mommy is very angry. Why did you come home late? And Chris says, John's bicycle broke. Oh, now you are a fundi for bicycles as well. No, mommy, I just sat with John and I helped him to cry. I just sat with John and I sat with John and I helped him to cry. You see, our challenge is not about fixing bicycles. I think what we need is men and women who will go into a weeping world and sit there and weep with the weeping world like Jeremiah does. Weep, not try to give answers. Weep with the weeping world. Friends, I thank you. And I pray that you will find hope in our journey with Christ, who journeys with us in our pain in communion, as a friend, true friend. That you will find around you, and that you will be for someone else the community that they are looking for. And that for the broken world, the world of Afghanistan that is broken, the world that is next door to us that is broken, the world that is asking questions around COVID, that you and I will be prepared to sit together with that world with no answers and just weep. God bless. Thank you, and thank you. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your support. Blessings.